Welcome to the Life Story 999 channel. Today, we will listen to an intense story about a police officer, a little boy, and an incident that makes one face an uncomfortable truth. The boy whispers. The father tries to control, but the police officer must decide the fate. Stay tuned to see what happens next, and don't forget to like the video, leave your comments, and subscribe to the channel for more insightful stories. Officer Tom walked into his usual diner after a long, exhausting day at work. The sun had set, leaving a golden glow on the street outside, and all he wanted now was a bit of peace, a hot meal, and some quiet. The diner was his go-to spot after work. Nothing fancy, but comfortable. As he sank into his favorite booth by the window, he hoped the day would end uneventfully. However, fate had other plans. Tom adjusted himself in his seat, letting out a tired sigh. As he glanced around the diner, taking in the familiar hum of clinking dishes and murmuring patrons, his eyes landed on something out of place. A small boy sitting at a table across the room. The child was staring at him, eyes wide with an innocence that seemed to carry an unspoken plea. Officer Tom couldn't help but wonder what was behind that intense gaze. He smiled slightly, hoping to break the ice, but the boy remained still, his eyes unwavering. The boy, who appeared to be around 4 or 5, was sitting with a man who seemed entirely oblivious to his surroundings. The man, whom Tom assumed to be the boy's father, was deeply engrossed in a phone conversation, his voice low and agitated. He gestured animatedly, his brow furrowed, clearly upset about something. It was almost as if the boy didn't exist to him. He never looked at the child, never acknowledged his presence. The boy sat there, his small legs swinging slightly off the edge of the chair, his expression a mix of curiosity and hesitation. Officer Tom knew it wasn't his place to intrude in a family matter, yet something about the situation felt off. Years of police work had sharpened his instincts, and right now, those instincts were telling him there was more to this than met the eye. He tried to shake off the uneasy feeling, telling himself he was probably overthinking it. Still, his eyes kept drifting back to the boy, whose gaze hadn't faltered. Just as Tom's meal arrived, steaming hot with the comforting scent of home-cooked food, he noticed a subtle change in the boy's demeanor. The boy shifted in his seat, his eyes darting towards his father, then back to Officer Tom, as if deciding something important. Then, the boy slid off his chair, taking small, careful steps towards Tom, his eyes wide and focused. Tom tensed slightly. Curiosity piqued as he watched the boy approach. What could a child this young want with a police officer? Tom pondered as he set down his fork, his attention now entirely on the boy. The air in the diner seemed to grow heavier, and time slowed down as the boy stopped just a few feet away. Tom gave him a reassuring smile, careful not to move too suddenly. He knew the boy was scared. He could see it in his eyes. Whatever this was, it was important enough for the boy to summon the courage to approach a stranger. "Hey there, buddy," Tom said softly, trying to ease the tension. "Is everything okay?" The boy hesitated, glancing over his shoulder at his father, who was still oblivious, his voice rising slightly in anger as he continued his phone call. The boy turned back to Tom, took a deep breath, and inched closer. Tom leaned forward, his heart beginning to beat just a little faster. He knew something significant was about to happen. He just didn't know what. The boy whispered, his voice barely audible above the clatter of the diner. Tom's face shifted from curiosity to concern as the boy's words sank in. Suddenly, the exhaustion from the day didn't matter anymore. Tom knew he had to act, and he had to act fast. Something was very wrong. Ben had been watching Officer Tom for a while, his small eyes full of curiosity and something else, a mix of hope and fear. Finally, he seemed to make a decision. With a tiny breath of courage, Ben slid off his chair and started walking towards Tom. His steps were hesitant, his small frame moving cautiously across the diner floor, as if each step was a question he wasn't sure he wanted answered. Tom noticed the boy approaching, and his curiosity grew. He set his fork down gently, watching as Ben inched closer. Tom knew how intimidating the uniform could be, especially to children, so he gave the boy a warm smile, hoping to put him at ease. But as soon as their eyes met and Tom smiled, Ben suddenly stopped. His courage seemed to falter, and before Tom could say anything, the boy spun on his heel and hurried back to his seat. Tom sighed, feeling a pang of disappointment. He hated seeing children afraid of the police. It was something that always bothered him. He wanted kids to see officers as protectors, people they could turn to when in need. But he understood that for many children, the uniform was often associated with fear and authority. Tom took a deep breath, deciding not to pursue the matter any further. He turned his attention back to his meal, trying to focus on the comfort of the warm food in front of him. Yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He glanced up again, seeing Ben now sitting with his head lowered, glancing back at his father, who was still engrossed in his phone call. The man's expression was stern, his voice rising and falling with frustration as he spoke. Ben looked small, almost lost next to him. Tom couldn't help but feel a sense of unease settle in his chest, but he knew he had to wait, to be patient. For now, the best thing he could do was to remain alert and ready, just in case the boy found the courage to approach again. Not long after, Officer Tom noticed Ben making his way towards him again. This time, there was a different look in Ben's eyes, one that made Tom's heart tighten. It wasn't curiosity or fear anymore. It was urgency, a silent plea that told Tom this was serious. Tom stayed perfectly still, not wanting to scare the boy off again, as Ben approached him with small, determined steps. Ben stopped just in front of Tom, his tiny fists clenched at his sides. He looked up at the officer, taking a deep breath. Tom leaned in closer, making sure he could hear the boy clearly above the clattering dishes and the low hum of conversations around them. The boy hesitated for a moment, then leaned in and whispered into Tom's ear, his voice barely audible. The words sent a chill down Tom's spine. Tom's face went pale as the gravity of Ben's words sank in. He knew right away that there wasn't a moment to lose. The fatigue from his long day disappeared, replaced by a rush of adrenaline. Tom knelt down to be at Ben's eye level, his voice calm despite the urgency he felt inside. "What's your name, buddy?" he asked softly. "Ben," the boy replied, his voice shaky but resolute. Tom nodded, offering a reassuring smile. "All right, Ben. I need you to stay right here with me, okay? I'm going to make sure everything is all right." He gently pulled a chair out for Ben, inviting him to sit while he worked. Ben climbed onto the chair, his eyes never leaving Tom's face, as if searching for reassurance. Tom stood up and quickly assessed the situation. Ben's father was still on the phone, his voice even more agitated now, completely unaware of what was happening just a few tables away. Tom pulled out his radio, stepping slightly to the side to keep his voice low. He called for backup, giving them a brief but concise description of the situation. His voice was calm, but his words carried a weight that conveyed the urgency of the matter. As he ended the call, Tom glanced back at Ben, who was sitting quietly, his small hands folded in his lap. Tom knew they had to act fast. Something was very wrong, and it was up to him to make sure Ben was safe. Officer Tom knew he had to tread carefully. There were other patrons in the diner. Families, couples, people just trying to enjoy their meals. The last thing he wanted was for the situation to spiral into something dangerous. His goal was to keep things calm, but his determination to protect Ben was unwavering. Tom kept an eye on Ben's father, who was still on his phone, oblivious to what was happening. However, that didn't last long. As the man finally ended his call, he looked around and his eyes widened when he saw Ben sitting next to Officer Tom. His expression twisted in confusion, quickly replaced by anger. He pushed himself up from his seat, his eyes locking onto Tom with a glare. "What do you think you're doing with my son?" the man demanded as he marched towards them, his voice loud enough to draw the attention of nearby diners. Tom could see the tension building, the man's face flushed with fury. He remained calm, his gaze steady as he kept a protective arm around Ben. "Sir, your son hasn't had anything to eat yet," Tom replied, his voice firm but controlled. He's hungry, and I'm just making sure he's all right. The father's face darkened, his fists clenching at his sides. He stepped closer, looming over Tom and Ben. Mind your own business, officer. That's my son, and I'm taking him with me. Now, Tom could feel Ben trembling beside him, the boy's small hand gripping his sleeve tightly. He looked up at the father, his eyes unwavering. I'm afraid I can't do that, sir. Not until I know he's safe. The man's face contorted in rage, and he took another step forward, his voice rising. You have no right. Tom interrupted, his voice like steel. I have every right to ensure a child's safety. If you cooperate, we can sort this out without causing a scene. The father opened his mouth to argue, but at that moment, the diner door swung open and two uniformed officers walked in. Tom gave them a brief nod, and they immediately moved towards the table. The father's eyes darted between Tom and the approaching officers, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. Please, sir, Tom said, his voice softening slightly. Let's handle this calmly. It's what's best for Ben. The man hesitated, his body rigid with tension, but the presence of the backup officers seemed to deflate him. He took a step back, his eyes still burning with anger, but he no longer made a move towards Ben. Tom let out a quiet breath of relief, knowing that, for the moment, the situation was under control. For a moment, the diner was filled with tense silence. Peter, the father, stood there, his chest heaving, his eyes darting between Officer Tom and the backup officers who had just arrived. The tension was palpable, a moment suspended in time where anything could happen. And then, Peter's expression shifted. His eyes widened with a flash of desperation, and without a word, he turned on his heel and bolted for the door. Everything seemed to move in slow motion as Peter dashed outside, the door swinging wildly behind him. Officer Tom's heart leaped into his throat. He immediately gestured to the backup officers, and they sprang into action, chasing Peter out into the parking lot. Tom stayed with Ben, his eyes never leaving the boy, who now looked more frightened than ever. Ben's small hand tightened its grip on Tom's sleeve, his eyes wide with fear. Are they going to hurt my dad? He whispered, his voice trembling. Tom knelt down beside him, his gaze steady and reassuring. No, Ben. They're just making sure everyone stays safe, including you. He gave Ben a small smile, hoping it would ease the boy's anxiety, even if just a little. Outside, the officers caught up with Peter just as he reached the edge of the parking lot. He fought back, his body twisting and turning, trying to break free. It took 3 officers to finally bring him down, their voices a mix of calm commands and firm instructions. Peter's rage seemed to know no bounds. He cursed and struggled, his face flushed red as he resisted with everything he had. Let go of me, Peter shouted, his voice echoing across the lot, drawing the attention of passers-by. One of the officers pinned his arms behind his back, while another spoke firmly. Sir, you need to calm down. Resisting will only make things worse. But Peter seemed beyond reason, his eyes wild with anger. Back inside the diner, Tom stayed with Ben, offering him comfort as they both listened to the commotion outside. He could hear the scuffle, the struggle, and finally, the clinking sound of handcuffs being secured. Tom looked at Ben, his voice gentle. It's going to be okay, Ben. You're safe now. Ben looked up at him, his eyes still full of uncertainty, but there was a glimmer of trust in them. Tom knew this was far from over, but for now he had done what he needed to do. He had kept Ben safe, and that was all that mattered. With Peter safely in custody, Officer Tom knew he had one more urgent task. He led Ben to his patrol car, opening the door and helping the little boy into the passenger seat. Tom knelt down in front of Ben, his eyes meeting the boy's. Ben, I need you to help me now. Can you tell me where your home is? Where your mom is? He asked gently, trying to keep his voice steady and calm. Ben nodded, his small voice barely a whisper as he gave Tom the directions. Tom could see the fear and exhaustion in Ben's eyes, but there was also a flicker of hope. Tom got into the car and started the engine, the siren remaining silent as they drove swiftly through the streets. He knew time was crucial. Ben's mother could be in serious danger. They arrived at a small, worn-down house on the edge of town. Tom parked the car and looked at Ben. "Stay here, all right? I'll be right back," he said, his voice calm but firm. Ben nodded, his eyes wide, and Tom locked the car doors before sprinting towards the house. The front door was slightly ajar, creaking as Tom pushed it open. He entered cautiously, his eyes scanning the dimly lit living room. Then he saw her, Ben's mother, lying on the floor, her face pale, her body motionless. Tom's heart sank, but he quickly snapped into action. He rushed to her side, dropping to his knees, and checked her pulse. It was faint, but she was still alive. Tom grabbed his radio, calling for an ambulance. "This is Officer Tom. I need medical assistance at 45 Elm Street. We have an injured woman, possibly unconscious. Please hurry." He ended the call and immediately began administering first aid, his hands moving with the practiced precision of someone who had done this countless times before. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" Tom called out, his voice urgent but gentle. The woman let out a faint groan, her eyelids fluttering. Relief washed over Tom. She was conscious, but barely. He worked quickly, applying pressure to a wound on her side to stop the bleeding, his eyes darting between her and the door, listening for the sound of the approaching ambulance. Moments later, Tom heard the distant wail of sirens growing louder. He looked towards the door, then back at the woman. "You're going to be okay. Help is on the way," he assured her, his voice steady. He glanced back at the patrol car where Ben sat, his small face pressed against the window, watching with wide, frightened eyes. The paramedics arrived, rushing into the house with a stretcher. Tom stepped back, giving them space as they began to work on Ben's mother. He watched as they carefully lifted her onto the stretcher, her face pale, but showing signs of life. Tom felt a sense of relief, knowing she was in good hands now. As the paramedics wheeled her out, Tom returned to Ben, opening the car door and crouching beside him. "Your mom is going to be all right, Ben," he said softly, placing a comforting hand on the boy's shoulder. Ben's eyes filled with tears and he nodded, a small, hopeful smile breaking through the fear. Tom knew there was still a long road ahead for Ben and his mother, but for now, they were safe. And that was enough. Officer Tom's actions were a testament to courage, compassion, and the duty to protect those in need. Throughout the ordeal, he fought against the odds, faced Peter's aggression, and ultimately ensured the safety of young Ben and his mother. His persistence and empathy transformed a moment of fear into one of hope and security. This story reminds us that doing the right thing, no matter how challenging or frightening it may seem, is always worth it. Tom's journey was not just about upholding the law. It was about standing up for a child who had no one else to turn to and a mother who was desperately in need of help. He saw beyond the uniform, beyond the rules and procedures, and acted as a human first. In that moment, Tom was more than just an officer. He became the protector that Ben needed, the guardian who refused to walk away when things got tough. Ben, though scared and uncertain, found the courage to approach Officer Tom and share his fears. It was a brave act for a young child, and it made all the difference. This reminds us that bravery comes in many forms. Even the smallest gestures can lead to the most profound impacts. Ben's courage to trust Tom and speak out about his fears was the spark that led to his mother being rescued. It's a powerful reminder that speaking up, even when we're scared, can change the course of events in ways we never imagined. Peter's actions were driven by desperation, but his choices led to consequences that could have been avoided. It's a lesson that our actions, especially those taken in anger or fear, often lead to unintended harm. It's a call for all of us to pause, think, and choose our actions carefully, understanding that they affect not only ourselves but those around us. The story of Officer Tom, Ben, and his mother teaches us about the importance of empathy, courage, and doing the right thing even when it's difficult. It's a reminder that heroes aren't always those in capes. They are often the ones who simply refuse to look away when someone is in need. Thank you for joining us on this journey. If this story touched your heart, please like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the Life Story 999 channel. Together, we can continue to share stories that inspire and remind us of the power of kindness and bravery. Don't miss out on our next story. Hit that subscribe button now